a lot of couples experience divorce each year in the UK. Family breakdown is a difficult life event, one of the most stressful things that can happen. We also know that both men and women, and of course, we say that in the context of same-sex relationships as well, experience a broad range of negative emotions following family breakdown, including things like fear, shame, guilt, sadness, and stress. However, when we look at the family breakdown literature and when we review it, we can see that there are a number of elevated risks and gender-specific issues that that emerge for fathers. So, for example, particular feelings of loss and grief and issues around co-parenting arrangements seem or appear to be more exaggerated for men following family breakdown, and abuse, specific gendered representations of abuse, have all emerged as issues in the father literature. That is, of course, not to say that mothers and women don't experience abuse following family breakdown. Of course they do. There is, however, some specifics that have emerged within the father literature about how that abuse is perpetrated, and also the opportunities for that abuse to be perpetrated towards fathers because of their existence as fathers. And I'll go on to that in a little bit more detail. And not only that, when you look at then the impact, it does appear to be much greater for men, with men around 11 times more likely to engage in suicide ideation following divorce, which would suggest that if you have the experience of family breakdown, even if the experiences are potentially similar, and even if their emotions are similar, there may be elevated risks for fathers following that breakdown because of a variety of reasons, which we'll get into in the project. However, when we looked at the literature, we realized that this kind of holistic examination of men's experiences was desperately needed. So all of those research findings had come from fairly siloed research. So either it was in the mental health arena or the family court arena or the abuse arena, and not really figuring out how those areas were related potentially. So we decided to try and do that with this project. So this project had two overarching aims. So it looked to understand the impact of family breakdown, separation and divorce, they're herein named FBSD, on fathers and their children through the testimony of fathers, and to understand how we can best support fathers and their children when experiencing FBSD. So those were our overarching aims. In terms of our specific research questions, we wanted to know what those experiences were, what the impact was with a specific focus on mental health, including suicide ideation. We wanted to know what support was available and the associated challenges with providing support, and to get a clear idea of what improvements can be made to ensure that fathers and children get the appropriate support. So it really was this kind of all-encompassing holistic examination of what happens, what the impact is, and what we can do about it better. And in terms of the methods, won't go into this in too much detail, but it's mainly to stress that this is objectively an incredibly extensive examination, and the most extensive examination of fathers post-separation outcomes in the UK. We did a quantitative case review, so we looked at data relating to over 1,000 fathers who had approached a support service over 12 months. We did a survey, which was an in-depth, and really, when I tell you the amount of data that we got, it was a really detailed qualitative survey with over 40 questions around the FBSD experience from over 130 fathers. We then invited 30 of those fathers to come in and have a semi-structured interview to get even more detail. And we also ran a deliberative inquiry with 6 organizations that supported fathers with FBSD. And those organizations sometimes supported just fathers and mothers. Sometimes they were more in the domestic abuse space, but obviously dealt with family breakdown as a part of that, but all had something to say about supporting men in this space. So it was a multi-study, multi-methods project that we ran over 12 months. And I still can't really believe that we did it all in 12 months, but there you go. And that's a credit more to my research assistant than to myself, I have to say. So study one was our case review. And we got a few kind of really headline figures from this review, and I've just highlighted a few here. So out of those 1,000 men, just over 1,000 men that had approached the service, just under half reported that they had experienced domestic violence and abuse in the last 12 months. 43% said they were part of an ongoing court case. So a huge amount of those fathers were involved in legal proceedings. 19% had alcohol or drug issues. So about a fifth had substance use or misuse flags. And crucially, this is probably the most important, and which is why it's an annoying, there's a spelling mistake there, but 42% had struggled with suicidal thoughts in the 12 months prior to their engagement with the service, which is a huge figure. When you then extrapolate that figure to the amount of fathers experiencing family breakdown in the UK each year, it means that there are thousands and thousands of men every single year that are at suicide risk. And when I was doing the interviews, there were at least 2 fathers that we spoke to where I believe that they were in that space when they conducted the interview, and we had to be very careful with our delivery of aftercare, etc., with those men. So just from the quantitative side, without getting into any detail, we see that there is an extreme risk here for men following family breakdown when they're engaging with the service. And we're doing more with this data as we speak to work out risk probabilities based on the other characteristics, because from some of the initial calculations that the organisation have done, we can see, for example, that when the men were involved in a court case and had experienced DV, the percentage of men, or the likelihood of them having suicidal thoughts, went up to around 65%. So it's an increased risk if there are other factors as well. So study 2 was, of course, our survey and interviews. So we combined them together into one large data set for study 2. And after months of trawling through and coding and analysing the data, we had 5 central themes emerge. So the first theme was around the family breakdown event itself. And we asked men to describe about their prior experiences. So what was the relationship like before FBSD? What was the event like itself? And then the emotions that followed. And a lot of the findings that we saw here were largely unsurprising. And I dare say will not be surprising to an organisation such as yourselves that support individuals in these situations. So when we're looking at prior to the FBSD event, what we found was that relationships were characterized by a variety of different kind of prototypes. There were some that were always bad and then just got worse after they ended. There were some that were really good for a long time and then they ended. So it really kind of presented that diverse reasoning for FBSD occurring. But one of the interesting themes that did come through was around the impact of pregnancy and birth on the relationship dynamic. And many of the men who spoke about their relations, well, actually, if the men spoke about it either being positive or negative, all of them spoke about this idea that pregnancy and birth of the child and the immediate postnatal period exacerbated or brought on any of the issues in the relationship. So that to me is a really important finding, because it suggests that we need much, much, much greater early intervention and pre and postnatal support for couples that we're potentially not delivering. And then in terms of the event itself, most of these were characterized as, discussions. They were either mutual or one party decided that they wanted to end it. There were some that ended very dramatically, as the quote here demonstrates. Came at me, she attacked me with a knife in the house. But the majority were not that extreme. And when you're thinking about the emotions, all of the typical emotions that we've seen in the literature came up and were as expected. Very painful, lots of sadness, shame, fear, guilt, anxiety, stress, etc. So a lot of the stuff that came through in this theme is not really surprising and reinforces the notion and the idea we have about FBSD in general as an event. The only thing that I think is really, really interesting is this idea that the kind of introduction of the parenting role was the thing that potentially exacerbated any issues and led to a kind of downward spiral to the FBSD event. When we then look at scene 2, this was around men's experiences of abuse, and many of the men in the sample spoke about experiences of abuse. About half of them spoke about this occurring during the relationship, and then most of the men then spoke about it occurring post-separation. So you had two basic groups, one who had always experienced abuse and that continued, and one who hadn't experienced that much abuse, and then they broke up and then the abuse began. So when you looked at the men that did have abuse during the relationship, there was the whole suite, as we know, that men can experience: physical, verbal, emotional, financial, sexual, coercive control, and the use of children, which we'll come on to in a minute. You know, one man said there was a verbal argument over something. She didn't like what I had to say. She straddled me, began to strangle me. She was really going for it. So that was one of the more extreme examples of physical violence. And then post-separation, this is where we got a lot of the similar narratives. So a kind of, gunning for the person, wanting to make their life miserable. And again, this spanning a lot of the literature that we see in post-separation abuse. So verbal, psychological, financial, and coercively controlling. Less physical abuse, obviously, because of reduced contact. And one of the central themes that came out of this as a sub-theme was, of course, parental alienation, which as an organization you'll be familiar with and probably deal with your client base. So, I mean, this sub-theme could have been a whole slide in and of itself, because there was around half of the men speaking about parental alienating behaviors, that their children were being used to control them, that there was this campaign of denigration, control and loss of contact, control of information. So a lot of the alienating behavioral suite that we associate with parental alienation was present in this sample. And when we start to connect and join up the dots, when we think about the experience of FBSD itself, a lot of the men talked about the kind of seeds of alienation occurring much earlier. That, for example, and this is all available in the full report, by the way, which is available, and I will share the link to. A lot of the men talked about, yes, there was kind of more clear alienation post-separation, but I see how it began earlier on with things like kind of gatekeeping of information, gatekeeping of time within the relationship that then progressed to full-blown alienating behaviors post-separation. So alienation was a really, really, really big problem within our sample. And as was mentioned, I have written a book this year on the subject. So one of the things that men talked about as being at the center of their experiences and the impact, which we'll talk about in the next theme, and everything seemed to coalesce around the co-parenting negotiation. Now, in terms of experiences, some men, a few men said, yep, we negotiated and we managed to work it out. The vast majority said that they experienced extreme difficulty in trying to negotiate co-parenting arrangements with their partner. And you see from this quote, for example, I've been trying to negotiate with her and through her solicitors for the past 2 years for some extra time, and it's just been blocked constantly. So I'm finding that impossible. So there were stories in the sample of mothers refusing mediation and the fathers feeling that they had no recourse to kind of make that happen. And of course, we then had a number of the couples progressing to court processes. And the experiences of court were unanimously, uniformly, and extremely negative. There were no kind of positive testimony around court. I think maybe potentially one father spoke about it positively, but most of them were talking about a system that was fundamentally broken, extremely draining, and that didn't value them as a parent, as a caregiver, and all about, you see here, the last quote, focused on the mother, the mother, the mother, the mother. So when we kind of situated that in men's narratives, we saw that actually a lot of their experiences of abuse that they spoke about were facilitated through their experiences of court, especially when you looked at alienation. And a lot of men spoke about the fact that, for example, court orders were broken with impunity. There was no way for them to get those court orders enforced in any way. And so we kind of see that link back to the abuse theme. And then when we move forward to the next theme, which is around the impact, a lot of this impact that fathers spoke about in terms of mental health was as a function of being in that court process and being alienated through that court process. Half of the men in our interviews, so 15 of the, oh no, I think it was 13 of the men out of the 30 spoke about the fact that they had experienced active suicide ideation. 2 of the men within their testimony spoke very explicitly about how they had tried to kill themselves. 2 weeks ago, I gave this presentation as part of my inaugural lecture, and I had a Q&A panel of 4 of the fathers who took part in the project came along, and one of them spoke about in that panel their experiences of trying to commit suicide because of the alienation, the court process, and the impact that it had on them. And we see here, you know, when you totally and absolutely love your kids and suddenly that's taken away from you, imagine somebody marched into your house and took away your kids for no reason whatsoever. Really no reason. It's a tremendous shock. There are a couple of times where I felt, not that I wanted to kill myself, but it felt so low I didn't want to continue. And interestingly, the one thing that did stop the men, and they were caught in this paradox between not wanting to live anymore, but feeling they had to keep living for a child that they weren't allowed to see. So it's difficult to know what stopped me, but it was, I again was thinking of the children. I thought that for me, it would be easier, but for the children, it would be devastating. And what happens if they've got to carry that for the rest of their lives? I can't do this to them. And that in and of itself is paralyzing for the men in this kind of vacuum of grief and loss that they're experiencing, because they want to end it, but then they feel that they potentially can't. I mean, many men do, but they feel that they can't. Some of them feel that they can't because of the children. And there was, of course, an impact on children as portrayed through the fathers' testimonies. So they were talking about this kind of loyalty conflict that they saw in their children. I want to love mum and I want to love dad. It's natural, but apparently one of them is terrible and I don't think they're terrible. So this idea that children really struggled with this as well. Of course, we didn't delve too much into the impact on children because we weren't speaking to the children directly, and that's something we want to do in the future. And then finally, when we were speaking to men about, okay, so if there is this massive impact, where do you go for support? We looked at coping mechanisms, and these largely fell into quote unquote healthy mechanisms and quote unquote unhealthy mechanisms, more of the latter than the former. Some men talked about exercise, you know, how that really helped them. Other men talked about more negative behaviors, so overeating, working too much, etc., not being able to sleep, engaging in alcohol and substance misuse. And then in terms of the support, a lot of the men focused actually on their informal support, which surprisingly in this sample was actually really robust. And the only reason I say surprising is because when we think about where this research for me originated in terms of the male victim literature of IPV, we actually, a lot of the time, we hear men saying that they're ridiculed if they reach out to people saying that they're the victim of abuse. When it comes to family breakdown, it's not quite the same story, because a lot of the men reported that the friends and the family and even co-workers and their employers had actually been really, really supportive. Where they did struggle was with formal support. And just to clarify and be absolutely clear, where support was available, it was said to be amazing. So there's a quote here about one of the organizations, Dads Unlimited, about them being fantastic and it's the reason they're alive. But then a lot of the men talked about the fact that they couldn't get to those services because of the wait list, etc. And also one really interesting quote where work actually arranged psychotherapy for them. So that was the testimony from fathers. As you can see, it's a fairly overwhelmingly negative picture, negative experience. And that is reflected by study 3, which was with the organizations. So when they talked about the support needed, a lot of the organizations talked about support at crisis point. So they were saying that often when the men come to their services, they are at breaking point. They are not engaging as a form of early intervention. They're basically engaging as a suicide prevention service. And that was specifically the approach of one organization that actually, even though, you know, they say we're here to support fathers through family breakdown, they characterize themselves as a suicide prevention service because of the prevalence of that issue. And in terms of the barriers, they talked about a lot of the things that we would expect around family breakdown, shame, embarrassment, etc. But there were also the classics around the male gender role, masculinity stereotypes, and also, of course, availability, which is reflected in the barriers to organizations, where they've said we've got big ambitions and very, very small bank balances. And I actually caught a little bit at the end of your AGM when you were acknowledging around the difficulties of funding that there is at the moment, I think, across the sector. And, you know, the organisations were, you know, distressed by this because they said things like the number of guys calling us every week is increasing exponentially, but they can't deal with the demand. And finally, they touched upon best practice, and they focused on, above everything else, above fathers, is actually orienting towards children. It seemed to be able to unlock not only kind of societal sympathy for them and their cause, but potentially funding as well if they focused on children rather than the fathers. So finally, this came together. We looked at the findings from all of the studies and we produced 4 key recommendations, which I'll then feed into some of the bigger issues. So the first recommendation that we came to was there needs to be some kind of family breakdown triage. There needs to be earlier, potentially community embedded intervention for families that are breaking down, where couples are grabbed at the point of breakdown and have some kind of oversight to these processes that do not allow them to escalate and do not allow individuals to become or to continue to be at risk. And that principally should focus around mental health support for men, but also around relationship and familial support for the family system in general. And there are models out there. I work with and I speak to some wonderful Finnish women who work in Finland for government mediation services, and they say it's a government-funded model. You know, this kind of mediation is free and available to everybody. You can go, you can have it, and it's an expectation that you go and you have it, and they help work out those issues. The second thing, and I know there's variation across the UK as to where this is enshrined. I know, you know, it's not obviously enshrined in England and Wales, is this rebuttal presumption of 50-50 shared care. We know, for example, in England and Wales that we have a presumption of parental responsibility, but that simply says there is an assumption that both are responsible for any decisions, but there's no parameters around involvement and contact. And even the presumption of responsibility is under fire at the moment. People want to remove even that presumption. So I think if we set an expectation that when families break down, that there should be a 50-50 default, and we see this in operation in many, you know, countries. We see it in states, in the US being trialed in 6 states, and we see it in the Scandinavian countries. It sets the expectation, and actually in those jurisdictions, there is a vastly reduced usage of family courts because people don't have anything to fight about unless it's actually very serious. That led on to, if people do end up in court, there needs to be a family court review. I know there's several actors in this space at the moment that are looking at this. And the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, for example, for England and Wales is one of them. Whatever my input to that would be, whatever review is conducted needs to fully and appropriately acknowledge the experiences of fathers as well as mothers, because a lot of those reports, and I have to say the DA Commissioner's most recent support, is fairly mother-centric and does focus around the experiences and has really only gathered the experiences of mothers in generating those reports. So whatever happens, there needs to be the acknowledgement of fathers. And potentially, if we're going further than that, at the moment, fundamentally, the family court, particularly in England and Wales, is not fit for purpose. It's dealing with issues that it is not designed to deal with, be that mental health and be that violence. So we need to figure out things like, what is the fundamental relationship between the civil and criminal courts? And fundamentally, how do we reduce demand in the first instance and keep people out of family court that don't need to be there? And finally, we need to change and challenge the stereotypes, because most of these issues, and I'll talk about this more in a second, are underpinned by a tiering of parental responsibilities and parental roles that place fathers in a secondary role. And those stereotypes have an influence right throughout the relationship and the breakdown, which then lay the foundations for post-separation inequity and issues. So that's kind of the project review in and of itself, but it feeds into a larger map. So this is the kind of what we put in the report as a a kind of image that conceptualizes this kind of process that we have seen, where we see that, you know, couples, if they are following an FBSD trajectory, they will move from the relationship to the FBSD event. They will therefore have to negotiate co-parenting arrangements, and some end up in court. And what this is designed to show is that, you know, negative stereotypes about masculinity and fatherhood can have an influence at all those stages, as can the presence of abuse. It doesn't have to, but it can. And what we are seeing is far too many people, men, exiting the event, the negotiation, and the family court stages down to the negative outcomes of substance abuse, self-harm, suicide ideation, whereas they need to be directed as early as possible to formal and informal support. So that's just a visual representation of everything that I've just said. But in terms of how this feeds into larger issues and the kind of bigger problems here, is we are embedding the precipitating elements for the post-separation issues and inequity for men right at the very beginning. Because we have, particularly in England and Wales, structural parental inequality, which is reflected through policy, practice, and societal stereotypes, which place fathers in a secondary position to mothers in terms of things like parental leave, stereotypes around those roles in relation to work, to pay, and just inherently in terms of the value that those parents carry when the relationships are intact. That leads to, and this is what a lot of the men talked about, was parenting inequality within intact relationships. And a lot of the men spoke about the fact that, yes, they did have to go back to work because they didn't have extended leave. And it bred bitterness on the part of both parties, because mothers feel abandoned, unsupported, and like they're married to useless Neanderthalic men. And the men feel constrained because they feel the great pressure with the male gender role to provide, protect, all of these things that we socialize boys and men to value. They go back to work and they're resentful because they're missing out on key time. And what does it breed within the relationship? Acrimony. Because you have bitterness, you have jealousy, you have resentment, you have inequality through the parenting roles, which the first three stages of this, you don't necessarily get, certainly not as strongly, in countries where you have, for example, paid parental leave for both parents, like in many of the Scandinavian countries. The issue is that when you have bred that acrimony, and this trajectory was representative of a lot of fathers' experiences in this study, when it came to relationship breakdown, which was sometimes as a result of that acrimony that had developed, but even if it wasn't, you then get the post-separation inequality, which is fed by all of the previous elements. So I actually think that this study speaks to a much, much broader issue with how we layer parenting and how we support parents within intact relationships and pre and postnatally within intact relationships. And I think a lot of the foundations for post-separation issues and inequality are laid earlier on. And I just had these two videos. I mean, I don't think they're going to work. So I won't play them, but I'll just describe them and then I'll provide a link for them. But this is a very famous advert that was from a few years ago. It was for Huggies, where they basically said, we're going to put Huggies to the ultimate test. We're going to leave the kids alone for a week just with dad. And it was kind of this massive joke to say, you know, this would be the ultimate challenge, wouldn't it, for this nappy and for these dads to look after their kids for a week. I've done that before. You know, it's part of parenting to me. So there was rightfully massive backlash. And then there's this other video, which is a wonderful video about a campaign that was run in India by Pampers, which looked to really focus on the idea that fathers should be more involved and that they hold great value as parents. But I'll include the links to those so that you can have a look at those. But in terms of just thinking about what we want to do next, in terms of how we can actually deal with some of these issues, I've split this into what I think we should be doing and what I am doing at different levels of intervention. So in psychology and health psychology, we talk about tertiary, secondary, and primary intervention. So tertiary intervention is when a problem has already taken hold and you're dealing with the outcomes of that. Secondary intervention is when you're trying to stop a problem from getting worse. And primary intervention is when you're trying to stop a problem develop in the first instance. So in terms of tertiary intervention, helping people where it's already an issue, we need to improve experiences of family court. That was the central finding from our project, if anything else, that we had these huge mental health issues and most of them were precipitated by family court involvement. So we need to explore the mental health impact of court involvement across the family system. And I've got a bid in at the moment with the Nuffield Foundation to engage in a project over 3 years to look at that. And if we don't get the money, we're going to try and do it anyway. We also want to explore the predictors of positive engagement. So I'm bidding at the moment to become one of the first people to get access to Ministry of Justice, CAFCAS and census linked data to look at what things do people do that predict positive engagement with family court, and also to continue to input on policy relating to family court procedures. So for example, I submitted a response to the FJC consultation on alienating behaviours recently to make sure that the experiences of fathers were represented. In terms of secondary intervention, this is around stopping a problem getting worse. So we want to, for example, evaluate the current services that do that. So one of the charities that I'm hoping to work with, and of course I would love to work with SBS as well, but we're working with Dads Unlimited to evaluate their service and establish a model of best practice. We want to investigate, for example, the use of family hubs that we have in England and Wales and other local authority services to support families. Is this, do we have to develop new infrastructure or can we use something that's already there? And to basically just increase the national provision for support in this area. And then in terms of primary intervention, we want to challenge stereotypes about parenting. So share and encourage those types of videos that you didn't get to see, but I will send the link to. Improving policy and practice across the life course of families. And one of the things I'm really excited to be a part of is developing an app for separating parents that will specifically assess their emotional readiness to engage in co-parenting post-separation, do an intervention if they're not, and then have them co-construct across the app a parenting plan. And of course, lobbying for a rebuttal presumption of 50-50 shared co-parenting arrangements with a view that this should be as close to, and that people need to come up with the arrangements that suit them the best, of course. So I just want to finish off with some acknowledgements. So all of the participants in the project, of course, for sharing their stories and being so open. And it was interesting because many of the men, once they got going, they obviously had a lot to say. I remember one participant spoke for 55 minutes uninterrupted once we began the interview, which is very unusual for a semi-structured interview when you're meant to be prompting. But it was fascinating to just sit back and listen. The Woodward Charitable Trust funded this research and we were immensely grateful to them. My research assistants were fantastic on this project, and so was the university in supporting this work. But this is also for my father, principally. It was in honour of him as someone who went through the family courts himself, fighting for custody of myself. I just want to end with this graphic that was shared to me by Dads Unlimited. It looks a little grainy, but you'll be able to get the gist. So all of the dots on this map are fathers that are engaged with Dads Unlimited as a service. They are based in Kent, which is why there's a higher concentration of dots in London and Kent. And every red dot on this map is a man who answered yes to "I've struggled with suicidal thoughts in the last 12 months." And my argument is that if we had the coverage of service for that they have in Kent and London, and you had an equivalent service in every county around the country, you would see a sea of red, and that represents the thousands of men every single year that are struggling with suicidal ideation following family breakdown. And that just leaves me with this project finding and finishing statement dedicated to all the dads we have lost. May we yet save many more.